You know, it's been a while since I have given an update on my thoughts regarding the impending breakdown in the American political regime. This is something that I discussed a lot in the wake of the election and all of the mess, which cannot be discussed here on YouTube. And I thought that what happened and the efforts made. Not that I won't use any specific terms, but you know what I'm referring to. In the wake of the election, I thought that was all very productive, if only as a way of delegitimizing the incoming administration and making it harder for them to pass laws which, in normal times, could be regarded as laws which are sort of for the public good, but in reality are just government power grabs, ways in which the government is trying to take away people's personal freedoms or take away their privacy and gain a better grip on the necks of ordinary Americans. And not only do I think that that is now the case, that the Biden administration is seen as deeply illegitimate by a large portion of the American populace, I think that all of their efforts to do anything are generally regarded with extreme suspicion. I think that it is a tremendous achievement that so many Americans view the sitting administration as bad faith actors. And I thought that was a good thing when Trump was president, too. And, unless Trump was trying to do something that I actually liked, in which case, it worked against me. But still, I think it's good for Americans to distrust their government and their president in particular. Because say what you will about the problems of having an illegitimate president as the executive of your country, but an illegitimate president can hardly become a dictator. We often think of leaders as seizing power in a country, as taking away people's freedoms, but in reality, those freedoms are always given up voluntarily. A leader or a government, bureaucrats, whatever the actor, whatever level you're trying to examine, authoritarian governance, they're only able to take away the freedoms of individuals. They can't take away the freedoms of everybody. It's kind of like the what was that whole joke from a couple years ago? The Storm Area 51 people. They said, hey, if we all Naruto run at the base at the same time, they can't stop us all. And there was actually some truth to that. And this is why this current administration now is having to take such a hard stance against so-called insurrectionists or anti-government people. They regard everyone, there's an insurrectionist now hiding under every rock. Everyone is, in the words of Biden, it's worse than the Civil War. The American right now is regarded as a greater threat to the regime in Washington than the Confederacy. That's a tremendous achievement. That's a wonderful thing to hear coming from Washington. It's good that Washington is afraid. They should be afraid. That means that there are people who are willing to stand up against them and just say no. Because they know it's not good enough for you to just go along and do as they say. You have to not only do as the regime says, you must do it and like it. You must worship them. You must thank them for what they do to you. Because as I was saying yesterday, and I didn't get too deeply into this, any political regime, in order to sustain itself, it needs the support of a super-duper majority of the population. It can deal with a small population of malcontents who regard the regime as illegitimate, but the greater share of a population, that falls into that category, that regards the regime with absolute contempt, it brings the regime closer to collapse, because there is some line that gets crossed where you reach a critical mass, and it doesn't have to be a majority, it just has to be some substantial portion of the population that says, no, we don't like the regime, we disagree with them, we will not obey them, and all of a sudden the resources of enforcement become insufficient. And once it's clear that the regime is no longer able to crush dissidents, well, then all of a sudden, a lot more people realize, hey, I can just say no too. I don't have to listen to them anymore. And then it all comes apart, just like East Germany. And this isn't just the case in totalitarian, governments like the German Democratic Republic. This is true of any government. Statists like to make us think that there's all these different kinds of governments and that it's very important, all these differences. And they are, interesting to study. All governments are not created equal. But they're not quite as different as you might think. They all have to live by these same rules that I just laid out. They have to maintain, support within a supermajority of the population. And the current regime in Washington knows that they have alienated a substantial portion of the country over the last 4 years. People who were, in many cases, some of the most loyal supporters of Washington, who, if you go back to 2003, were prepared, over the Iraq War to condemn any other government on earth who merely questioned the Iraq War on behalf of Washington. These same people now regard the folks in Washington as illegitimate rulers who are nothing but a bunch of stuck-up bureaucrats who don't care about them and should be, if not overthrown, at least held in contempt. And so what I think is that we essentially have laid the groundwork for a final collapse of the United States political system. I think that is on the table. The question now is, what would be a sufficient catalyst in order to kick that off? Because it doesn't just happen on its own. A political regime is not just weak enough that that it would fall just because people don't support it. There has to be something to push people over the edge. There has to be some kind of crisis which challenges the stability of the regime, and then the inherent instability of the regime will result in its collapse. And I think far and away, what the most likely catalyst for an event like that would be is the next economic recession, the bursting of the current economic bubble, which was blown by the Federal Reserve, beginning in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis, the way they tried to sweep all that under the rug and just continue and blow another bubble very irresponsibly, in the way in which they continue to try and keep pumping more air into the bubble. It has done so much to try and conceal the inherent contradictions in American society. It has done a lot to paper over the economic degradation of the United States, and thus the degradation of American society. The bubble, which has, grown up in the wake of 2008, has continued the trend which began back in the 80s of massive and ever-expanding trade deficits, which are financed by the Federal Reserve, which enable Americans to literally consume more than we produce as a nation every year. And so even though our economic base has weakened so much, we do not feel that as much as we should. Our purchasing power has not taken the hit that it should have. And so there is a gap between how much we as a country consume and how much we produce. At some point, that gap is going to close. And when it does, it will result in a steep decline in the standard of living in this country, because we simply cannot support our current spending habits. And again, I'm not just talking about the federal government spending habits. I'm talking about the spending habits of ordinary Americans who continue to go into more and more debt. And even those who don't have individual personal debt, their careers are built on the debt of other people. Our economy is built on a mountain of debt, which only sustains itself, let alone, expands, by continually issuing more and more debt. And eventually, this debt, since it can never be paid back, will have to be written down. There will have to be mass bankruptcies, a national bankruptcy, if you will. And that will occur at the end of this current business cycle, because the Fed has made it clear that they will not contract monetary policy themselves. They will not raise interest rates voluntarily. This whole system is going to run with the gas pedal put to the floor until something blows up. It could be any number of things. It's probably going to be something that none of us are thinking about right now, that I have never conceived of in my head. And perhaps, within, once it happens, within a year or so, we'll look back and go, oh, that was totally obvious. How did we not see that coming? Or who knows, maybe it is something that I talk about a lot on this channel, and that will end up being the catalyst, or not the, that'll be the catalyst for the broader financial collapse. But I don't want to get too much into the financial collapse itself today, because I want to speak about it in more general terms, because I want to focus more on the political collapse, which that will serve as the catalyst for. So, skipping past the mechanics of the economic crisis, what that crisis will result in is ultimately going to be a deflation of asset prices. Asset prices, by many metrics, are incredibly overvalued. Anyone can tell you that, so I won't get into the details of that. But when asset prices collapse, interest rates will rise. The Fed will be able to do nothing about it, because the Fed will not be the ones raising interest rates. Interest rates will be going up despite the Fed's best efforts at this point. And so therefore the Fed will be neutralized. They will be taken out of the game. And so people will look to the federal government to save them and say, hey, my stocks are now worth 1/4 of what they were before. My house is worth half of what it was before. My assets have been wiped out. And the federal government will be broke themselves, because any spike in interest rates, considering how heavily indebted the federal government is and how short-term the debt of the federal government is. It's not like the federal government has $28 trillion locked in at 1%, in 30-year Treasury bonds. That's not the case at all. This debt has to be constantly refinanced. And if interest rates are to spike, which, they will in the case of significant asset price deflation across the board in all three major, asset classes, bonds, stocks, and real estate, you will see an interest rate spike. That is going to bankrupt the federal government. And so the federal government will be rendered impotent as well. And considering that a substantial portion of this country already does not like the federal government, does not want the federal government around, if the federal government ceases to be of any use to them and is of no help, even in the darkest of times, when they need help the most during an economic catastrophe, you will see states, if not explicitly, implicitly secede from the Union and essentially operate and conduct themselves independent of Washington, because Washington will be neutralized by the next financial crisis. There will be no motivation across all 50 states to come together and to save Washington or to replace Washington with something new. It's similar, you could say, to what happened in the late 80s, early 90s in the Soviet Union and in Yugoslavia. Both of those were federal countries, and they both were overextended financially. Eventually, the bill came due. I won't get into the details of the economic woes of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, but when the bill came due, they were broke. The central government needed to be bailed out or saved or go bankrupt or something, and the constituent states of both of those federations chose to go their separate ways and said, you know what? We don't really want this federal government anyway. And so when you think about the breakup of the United States, it's not like it's going to be I don't think it's going to, unless the Biden administration or future administrations really, they overplay their hand and they do something crazy like try and take away a bunch of people's guns. Putting that aside, which that is a question for a whole nother day. That would lead to a completely different scenario. But putting that aside, if we just continue along as we have been, as we are right now, the federal government will be able to mutter through. And the breakup of the U.S. will not be a hard divorce over political issues. It will be a more pragmatic one. The federal government will, in essence, even though yesterday I said the federal government won't wither away, perhaps I should contradict myself, because today I think that is an appropriate phrase in this particular scenario. In this scenario, because the federal government will be bankrupt, because it will be powerless, it will have no power to spend, really, because it will be, it'll have to default on its bonds. The 50 states will have no choice but to act independently and to do things on their own. The federal government just won't be there to do anything. And so some of those states might link up into regional federations. I think that's likely in the long run. But in the short run, the American flag will remain. It will still fly, but it will have lost its meaning. And I don't mean lost its meaning in a, we lost our freedom sense because the American flag means freedom. I don't mean that. I mean what the American flag means to me right now is it is a symbol of the government in Washington. And if the government in Washington effectively ceases to exist, the American flag will lose its meaning as well. At least it will lose that dimension of its meaning. It will no longer be flown, really, at government buildings. It won't make much sense. Perhaps the British Empire is another good example, although not so much because that was colonialism. But there was a period, even after World War II, in which there was a huge huge portion of land across this planet flew the British flag, until one day they just didn't, because the British Empire went broke. They had no way to sustain their presence there. And so the British Empire essentially withered away. The British slowly withdrew themselves, and the people who were left behind no longer answered to London, at least not directly. You could say they did indirectly through, intelligence agencies and things, but there was no longer a British commissar or a British high commissioner, I guess you would say, or a British governor who had any real authority over these colonies. The Bahamas, for example, still recognizes Queen Elizabeth as their head of state. Queen Elizabeth II is the Queen of the Bahamas. But do they look to London for their laws? Do they care about what goes on in British Parliament? No, it has no effect on them. British Parliament has no way of reaching out to these people and doing anything to them. They have no power over the Bahamas anymore, even if they nominally are still somewhat linked politically. And so it's possible for there to be a similar situation which unfolds in the United States, a forced decentralization, which is the result of an economic crisis. And if you remember, at the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union attempted to create an institution similar to the British Commonwealth of Nations, which is, the successor to the British Empire. And it includes Australia and the Bahamas and Jamaica and Canada and New Zealand and there's multiple sort of ranks within them. There are countries that recognize the Queen as their queen, and there are other countries who are totally separate politically but are still within the Commonwealth of Nations. And that's because the British sort of gave up. They didn't dig in their heels when they were in decline. They managed their decline of their empire, and they withdrew somewhat on good terms. With the Soviets, however, the Commonwealth of Independent States, is that what they called it? That was sort of the successor organization they tried to develop. It did not last very long. There was too much animosity within the post-Soviet states, and that did not last. Even that very loose association did not last. There was ultimately no successor to the Soviet Union. And I think that the United States is more likely to go that path. But again, I think it will be along that Soviet, British, Yugoslav, whatever model of an economic collapse. I think that we won't see the various, the 50 states just remain as these de facto independent but nominally associated union of 50 states. I think that it's more likely that they do link up and form regional unions, which do have more substantive powers, more akin to what Washington has now. That's not something I would like. I prefer the maximum amount of decentralization. But these are details that will be worked out in due time. Now, currently, I do not have a timeline for when the economic collapse will begin. I would like to do an update on that and try to examine where we are now and how the bubble continues to march along. I need to re-examine it from that lens, because for the last few months I've kind of just been looking at it in a medium term, kind of what direction are the markets going and why are they moving in certain directions on a more granular level. But I need to step back and take a look at this, at the big picture, so that I can better position it within this broader model for coming political collapse of the United States. So just to be clear, I don't want to say that any of this is set in stone. There are still plenty of possibilities for the federal government to overplay its hand, which I've talked about extensively in the past. I've used the gun control example. That's probably the easiest way in which to imagine that there could be a hard fork in the United States, meaning a hard split where certain states completely disassociate from the federal government. But if there isn't anything about gun control coming up the pike before the midterm elections, if the Democrats lose one house of Congress or both, that can essentially be taken off the table. In which case we will see a a continued malaise in Washington. We will see this continued decay, which unfortunately I do think can continue until there is a major crisis. And again, you can have an economic crisis or a political crisis. A big gun grab would be a political crisis. Any kind of crisis at this point, as fragile as the federal government's grip on power is, I think that any substantial crisis like that could bring about a downfall. But that downfall would be different. A financial collapse would lead to a soft breakup, whereas a political crisis, which leads into a political collapse, would result in a hard national divorce. You would see individual states banding together in opposition to federal policy. So, with that said, I guess I will end things off here for today.